Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Working with Interpreters. I'm Sandy Nickel and I'll be facilitating the session today, so a little bit of a DJ voice that you might hear in the background. So just a couple of housekeeping items before we get rolling. So as an attendee, you are joined in mute, so you won't be able to chat. We will be responding to questions at the end of the session, but please ask your questions as they come up or come to you throughout the session. And to ask a question, just use the Q&A feature. You will see interlocking thought bubbles at the top of your screen with question marks in them. And you can upvote a question by clicking on the thumbs up for the question that you're upvoting, and we'll answer the most voted questions first. So today we have Chelsey Yee with us from the Family Center's Centralized Interpreter Services program. Chelsey is certified with the Child and Youth Care Association of Alberta and is registered with the Association of Counselling Therapy of Alberta as a child and youth care counsellor. In her professional practice, she has worked in various capacities, providing support to children, youth, and families. With a desire to support vulnerable populations, she has worked at the Family Centre for 7 years and has spent the last few years supervising their Centralized Interpreter Services program. This program was founded in 1989 with a mission to bridge the communication gap between individuals worldwide. Family Centre offers qualified and certified professionals who provide services focused on quality, efficiency, and personalized solutions. With over 30 years of industry experience, the program provides interpretation, translation, and transcription services in over 80 languages and dialects. So, Chelsey, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hello, everyone. I hope that this is working. So yeah, I'm Chelsey. I am here to talk about what your role would look like as you work with interpreters. During our time together today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the right to an interpreter that our clients and the people that use our services have, what interpretation and translation really is, how we utilize interpreters, how you can then access them, and then, as Sandy mentioned at the end, we're going to answer some of your questions. So a little bit about the Family Centre. I know Sandy introduced us a little bit, but as an agency, we got incorporated in 1942, and our Centralized Interpreter Services specifically started in 1989. We now have, at that point, we wouldn't have had 80 languages and dialects, but now we have over 80 languages and dialects with 200 interpreters, and we're growing, always wanting to fill that need and that gap in the community. Our agency vision is to have those healthy families in that healthy community, and that's why we exist. That's why this program exists. Our CIS direct mission is to increase the access to mainstream services for limited and non-English speaking individuals. And so that's why we got started. And our goal then today is to talk to you about what interpretation is going to look like and how you can utilize that to make sure that it's not a gap in the practice that you're doing with your clients. So why interpretation is necessary. Our last census for Alberta was in 2016, and it showed that 11.2% of Canadian immigrants reside in Alberta. And this means that over 1 in 5 Albertans identify themselves as immigrants. We are actually the 3rd highest proportion of immigrants in Canada. So Ontario and BC have more immigration population, but we are 3rd in line. So there's a lot of immigrants in our province who would benefit from an interpretation and translation service when there are opportunities that they don't understand, and the language can be a barrier, and our culture and our systems can also be a barrier, and that's an important part of our interpreters can play as well. So because we have such a diverse population in Alberta and across our country, there actually is some guides in place that ensure that people have a right to an interpreter. So our Canadian Human Rights Act recognizes that persons with disabilities have a right to full integration and participation in society. So that's including some of our deaf or mute clients or service users within our practice. And then also, I know that this is court specific, as it says here. It says, according to the Supreme Court of Canada, all health regions, employers, and service providers have a legal duty to accommodate people with disabilities to enable them to work or to access an essential service. And so even though this is Supreme Court of Canada, as we think about all of the work that we do and the types of services that we offer, whether that's a language assessment or a hearing assessment or the different types of work that you're all doing and that wonderful work you're doing in the community, they have a right to being able to understand and access that service. Same in other settings as well, that they're able to know that if they're going to a medical appointment, that if they, or at the hospital, that if they're not understanding something, that they can have an interpreter so they can understand and they get proper treatment. Same within our legal and justice system. And so we just want to keep this in mind as the framework as we go into our practice, whatever type of service we're offering and whatever settings we're in, that people should have the right to be able to have access to an interpreter and to somebody to help bridge any language gaps that may exist. So what is interpretation and translation? There is a difference, and there's different types of services that happen within each of those. Interpretation specifically is when an interpreter provides a bilingual or bicultural person who is trained to assist in the communication process between a non-English speaking person and an English speaking person or service provider for an organization or some form of representation. That interpreter then facilitates the cross-lingual, cross-cultural, helping all participants involved to understand the beliefs, practices of each other relevant to the culture and linguistics meanings. So in settings like this, we're talking about, it can be the language, but then also some cultural pieces. Sometimes when people immigrate here, our processes or our systems aren't the same as where their home country is. And so they don't know our systems. They don't know all of the logistics of what we're doing. And so sometimes an additional part of what we can do with an interpreter is they can share some of Canada's culture and background as to why we're doing what we're doing or why we're saying what we're doing, and vice versa. Sometimes that interpreter can also bring in a cultural perspective to the service provider who maybe doesn't know much or as much about that own culture for the client they're working with. Why there might be a specific type of response to it in a certain situation, or why things may look different, or why they're doing things the way that they do. Not that either is wrong or either is more right than the other, but to help explain things to each other. So it's about language and cultural backgrounds that an interpreter can bring to a setting. There's also different types of interpretation or things to be aware of when we're interpreting. We need to be aware of the spoken language. So there can be different languages and dialects within a same region. There can also be different regions that have different slangs and lingo that are harder to understand. Even just with English that we're all thinking about, we have Canadian English, we have American English, we have UK. And so there's different ways of spelling words that mean the same. There's different pronunciations of words. There's different utilization of words. We call fries chip or fries, and in Europe or in England they call them chips, and they're the same thing. And so there's pieces like that that can also exist within the languages that our interpreters are using. And so it's important to be mindful of which language your client speaks, and including their dialect or the region that they're from as well. It's also important when we're working with deaf or mute or hard of hearing individuals that there are also different types of sign language. American Sign Language is the most common in Canada, but sometimes, and not everybody understands American Sign Language. And there's also deaf interpreters who can bring a different dialect of practice to communicating with an individual as well. So it's important to really know what type of interpreter you're bringing into a setting and what their role will be. Translations, on the other hand, which we're not going to spend as much time on today, but I think it's important to define, is about the translation of a written document. It's translating something from English into a targeted language, or from that targeted language into English. Translations can also be completed, like they can be completed in advance, where it's a request to have this form or this letter translated. But there's other times where it might be asked to be done on the spot. And this is what we call a site translation. So this is where maybe they show up to an assessment and there is a form or a consent that needs to be read and explains that the client can sign it. That would be a site translation. Sometimes you might choose to have that be a formal translation that is proofread and finalized and like is available in their own language to sign, but there's other times where you might just have them do it on the spot. There are differences there. And so, yeah, interpretation is the translation of spoken word between two people, and translations is the translation of a written document, typed out words. Those are the two key differences. And today we're going to specifically talk about how to utilize interpreters. So we're going to utilize those interpreters. What do we need to know to be able to get that going? So when should you consider using an interpreter? A great time if the individual requests that. The individual just straight up asks, I want an interpreter. Find a way to get them an interpreter. If English is that individual's second language, or they don't fluently speak or understand English, especially in situations where things may be more stressful or more complex or unfamiliar, like I think about times where we're giving like a diagnosis, or we need to explain follow-up instructions or next steps. When things can get kind of nitty-gritty, it's really helpful to have an interpreter present, because we may think that they understand because they've been able to have lots of pre-conversations with us. But when things start to get more stressful or complex, some of that can change. And in their brains, depending on like if they're being triggered or if they go into a state of alarm, their understanding of their second language may change, or their ability to comprehend and remember and retain that information may also change. Some examples of when it may be helpful to consider would be like medical appointments, assessments, or interviews. Those are some good times to consider when you might want an interpreter. Or if you notice that like in some of those settings, they're really only giving limited responses. But at the end of the day, a conversation with your client, or a way to connect with them about whether an interpreter is a good fit, is a great place to start, to have that conversation. Make sure that they're going to feel comfortable having an interpreter present. Making sure that maybe there's somebody who they already know who they feel comfortable with, who they utilize for interpretation sometimes. Those are good pieces to just include in your conversation and consider when you're going into some of these settings. Should I have an interpreter? What should this look like? Am I missing something? Are they really understanding what's going on? Are they going to be okay and make it through this process well? So as I just mentioned, that sometimes they might know somebody who has maybe been their interpreter. Sometimes this is family members or community members, or just somebody they know, or somebody who's maybe interpreted for them in the past. So there can be what we call then more of an informal interpreter. This is somebody who can do the job great in some settings and has helped them out before, but they're maybe not like a certified professional or associated to an organization for interpretation. And so there's also professional interpreters, and that is typically somebody who is employed by an organization to be a professional interpreter. We'll talk more about those differences and what the benefits of that would be after as well. Some things to maybe consider if you're deciding that you would like to use more of an informal interpreter, whether that's family, friends, volunteers, community members, whoever that may be. There are some potential risks to that dynamic. And I say potential, and I want to make sure that that's known, because this doesn't mean that these people aren't good at interpreting. They could be great. They could be easily hired by a professional organization in no time. But just it's some things to be aware of. They may have lack of subject specific knowledge. So they might not know, I know in your field, as much about the specifics around the assessments that you're using, or the tools that you're using, or what your next steps would be, or how that process goes. They might not have all of that quite professional touch that comes with utilizing a professional. They may be inexperienced in handling difficult or different situations where they haven't had to give a diagnosis before, they haven't had to do an assessment before, so they're unsure, and then that impedes the outcomes. They may have a lack of cultural awareness about either side, because this person, like we said, there can be differences depending on region. So there could be differences around the cultural awareness for our own country or for their home country and where they're from. They could do an inaccurate interpretation because they might not have that skill set or that language or that dialogue or know those like more complex terms. And so they might not be able to do the most accurate interpretation. They may have some personal bias or distortion. So they know this person. So they might have some opinions to want to help them or guide them, or and it was probably out of the kindness of their heart or their desire to do good. But there can be bias. There can also then be lack of confidentiality. They are community members or family members. This person now knows these extra personal details about them, and so wanting to protect that as well. They can be uninformed about what the role of an interpreter really looks like, or what the role of the interpreter needs to look like in your specific setting. And they could lack explanation regarding cultural differences. So some of those differences between the cultures, and not be able to bridge that as well and add as much context to that situation to help both parties work in a unified form. So this is important to know, because sometimes there are risks if we have inaccurate interpretation. Some of those risks, I tried to get this more specific to who I believe your audience would be misdiagnosis, inadequate or inconclusive outcomes, repeat testing, frustration for you and the service user, added stress or confusion, lack of accountability or follow through. You could potentially, like, your continued work with that client could be impeded, like your ability to keep providing the good work and support, depending on how that interpretation goes and how that impacts that client experience. So these are just important things to know as we look at wanting to make sure that our interpretation is accurate. And that's why there's benefits to using a professional interpreter. This might not always be possible. And like I said earlier, some of your informal ones that are those community members or family members are amazing, and they do great work and they really help us out. There are some great benefits to having a professional interpreter. They will often have more experience interpreting because they're doing this as their job. It's what they do. It's their niche. They have training and they understand the role of the interpreter. They really understand where their limits are, where their boundaries are, what's expected of them. They're also held by professional standards. There isn't a national regulating body for interpreters like there is for the speech and language pathologists and audiologists. But there is some certifying organizations across the country, and there is like a national guide for community interpreters. And so within that national guide, some of the things that are the standards and the ethics that these interpreters are set to uphold are accuracy and fidelity, confidentiality, impartiality, accountability, professionalism. And those are things that when they're partnered with an organization, that organization helps them uphold to those standards. It helps them ensure that there's additional training. It helps make sure that they know their limits of confidentiality and gives them the ability to maintain impartial. Sometimes that means being reassigned or having a different interpreter assigned to a case to make sure that there is no conflicts of interest. It adds the accountability of having that person show up because they're being paid for their job and doing their job. And having that professionalism, there's another person or agency to go to for that support as well as another benefit to using a professional interpreter. They're also, as a whole, they may have experienced specific assessment training. And so they're able to better support that assessment process or testing process or diagnosis conversations and further support that treatment process. So when there are like ongoing follow-up appointments around like guiding and supporting and helping, they know a little bit more about those situations and how to support them. And so those are some additional benefits to using a professional interpreter. Like specifically with their confidentiality, this is what that national guide says about interpreters. Interpreters will not disclose and will treat as confidential all information learned, either uttered or written, in the performance of their professional duties. So all of that needs to stay confidential. That's what's written in the National Standards Guide for Community Interpreters. So we ask, our own agency asks our interpreters to advise all parties that to respect that confidentiality at the start of their sessions, to make sure that people know that it's confidential and we're part of that team to make sure that it stays confidential, and that they won't disclose any of that information outside of that interpretation situation. They're not going to share details about the time of the appointment, where the appointment took place, who was there, what type of assessment they were doing, any of those pieces. With our interpreters, not just ours, all interpreters, there are different types of delivery options. So you can have in-person sessions, you can have phone, video, you have options on how you're going to access your interpreter, just like how you probably, due to the pandemic, have really diversified the way you deliver your service. Maybe I'm a little bit old school, but I feel like in-person is still the best approach and the best delivery for longer, more complex cases, especially with an interpreter. But I know that this hasn't always been possible during COVID, and I know that our practices are changing. So that may change, but I still right now feel like the best way when we're doing those more complex interpretation cases is in person. It allows all parties to really be aware of those added cues of like facial expressions, body language, whether they're fidgeting or like if there's any added things going on in that conversation that they need to be aware of. It's best for clients who maybe struggle with hearing or distractions or focus. Having them in person really allows you to gauge that a lot more, make sure that they understand. Individuals may feel more at ease when the interpreter is present because there's more relationship. They're more real. They're there. They're with them. And it helps everyone stay that more engaged piece. With video, this is a really great alternative to in-person. And we've learned that a lot during COVID, as I'm sure we all know, is it's the great runner-up to in-person. It allows us to still have these interventions while we aren't able to be in the same space. This can be incredibly helpful as we move forward. And we're looking at situations where maybe the interpreter or other parties can't all be together because of distance, or there's no space available, or there's other factors that might play in. And so the video is a great runner-up option to in-person, to making sure that everybody can be there and be present. Phone is also an option for interpretation. We feel that this is really best for more simple and brief conversations that are a little bit less complex, have less of all the little nitty-gritty details where you maybe need to see a facial reaction or a body language or a nod. It's really helpful for quick conversations, like confirming an appointment or double checking an appointment or giving brief pre-conversations like, please make sure that you bring XYZ to your appointment. Those are great to happen over the phone. Nobody needs to come together for those and have extra face-to-face interpretation in meetings when it's not necessary. So that's where the phone is really awesome. But it is another alternative if maybe video isn't an option or there's tech issues, because we know that that's an added component for video. So it is another good option for interpretation as well. So when we are using an interpreter, what is the role of the professional? Being you, the person requesting that service or hosting that meeting. We ask that that individual who needs that interpreter, the professional in that setting, coordinates that interpreter, makes that request, helps make sure that that interpreter is there and good to go. That person then ensures that the individuals that will be present know that an interpreter will be there, so that they're not blindsided when the interpreter shows up. Ensure that the interpreter is aware of any special or specific instructions which may impact that meeting. So if you're able to like connect with them in advance to do any form of like, hey, we're going to be doing this assessment when it happens, I need you to just read the sentence once and no other cueing, no other prompting. Don't head nod, don't anything, because it impacts that outcome. To have that brief moment with that interpreter to say that is really helpful to ensuring that they know what type of assessment they're going into. You're the professionals when it comes to all of the pieces that you're supporting with this work. And so just to help that process, it's really helpful if you can give a couple little tips or tricks or special instructions beforehand. Introducing the interpreter is a great key. So once that session gets started, to introduce them so that they know who they are. They've already given them the heads up and now it's in this room. Hey, this is Cindy. She's our interpreter today. She's going to be joining us, just that there's that connecting point. We ask that when you're in that session, you try to speak directly to the individual who is getting that interpretation. Speaking in a conversation to them specifically, almost as though the interpreter isn't there. It keeps that conversation flowing as though it's between just the two people. Take pauses to allow that interpreter to be able to actually follow up with what they're saying, so that if you say a couple of sentences, that they can say those couple of sentences. But if you say like a whole paragraph, they're going to miss some pieces, or maybe some improper interpretation may happen. And then everything that is said in that interpretation will be interpreted. So if we've seen examples where sometimes in an interview of sorts, a client will say something to the interpreter and kind of say, but don't tell them this. This is just information for you and I. And that doesn't help keep the trust in that room. And so our interpreters are told to tell that client, well, I'm going to have to share that, and then share that with that person as well to keep that communication flowing in that room and open. And it's a good prompt to have before you begin, to share that with both the client and the service provider, so that everybody knows that everything that is said will be interpreted. Some things to be aware of during that interpretation session. I know that this is, some pieces of it may be a little bit repetitive, but just the things specifically, like just to be mindful of during that session. Speaking directly to the client, taking those pauses, being mindful of your talking speed. This is especially important when we're reading scripts. We get really good at reading the same script over and over again and getting faster at reading that, and that can be harder to interpret if it goes too quickly. Everything that will be said will be interpreted. Avoiding jargon or technical terms. Sometimes technical terms are 100% necessary, and at that point, making sure that it is explained. So if a terminology is given, that then it's followed with a definition so that people can understand what that terminology is. But sometimes those specific terminologies don't translate into other languages. They are very much English terms, and so they don't directly translate, so they can make things more complicated if we just attach them to a name. So if we do attach them to a name, that we try to explain what they are so that the client can understand. Cultural impacts. This is the interpreter may choose during that session to add a component and say, hey, I just want to give I'm going to add a little bit of context here. This is what I'm planning to say. And then they'll add the context with your kind of blessing as the professional. And then they'll add that context to the client, or they may say the same thing to the client. Can I clarify this, or can I share this piece to give the context? And then they'd give that to the professional as well. So that way those cultural impacts are included. Be aware of the time that the session requires. So you now have an interpreter present. So if you normally needs an hour and now you have to slow things down to have an interpreter talk after you, you might need an hour and a half or 2 hours or 3, depending on the case and what's going on and all those pieces. You just be mindful of that, or be willing to maybe break it up into multiple sessions. And that interpreter is truly just there to interpret. They're not there to now become a family support worker or the person that helps them with all those other pieces. I mean, maybe if it's a family member, maybe they are the person that goes home and helps them with some homework or follow-up instructions. But if it is a professional interpreter, that person's not going home with them. They're not going to be able to continue to provide support beyond that initial session. So those are the things we need to be aware of and mindful of when we're in those sessions. And these are the things that we should do when we're in those sessions. Again, this is for the professional, you as the requester. Brief the interpreter in advance. Introduce that interpreter to that audience. Ensure the client is aware of the interpreter's confidentiality. Speak directly to the client. Take pauses. Be mindful of the talking speed. Provide clarification when needed. So if you notice that clarification may be needed, or you may need to repeat something, take the time to do that. Ask if the client understands. I know that sometimes in the settings we're in, that might not be an option because there's certain parts of it that are testing that are more rigid. But in the times when we're having more of a conversation, if we can provide clarification or ask them, does that make sense? Do you understand? Do you have questions? It really just helps eliminate that barrier for that any potential language gaps that may still exist. We ask that you don't ask interpreters for their opinions. We also ask this of our clients. Our interpreters, as part of their professionalism within that ethical guide, is that they don't give advice. And so sometimes my specific interpreters, they go to hospital settings and people will ask them, well, what would you do? And our interpreters are asked to respectfully say, I'd encourage you to connect with the doctor. Can I ask the doctor for you? And then they bridge back to the doctor or back to the professional, or say, it's not my place to give an opinion. This is your chance to make your own decision. And so it's important that we don't ask interpreters to say, help them make a decision, help them figure it out. Avoiding that jargon or technical terms. We've already talked a little bit about that and when to use that. And then closing of that call. So wrapping up that call and saying, okay, that's all we have for today, and ending the video call or dismissing or ending that in-person meeting. That way it all gets wrapped up. Some reminders for phone and video interpretation, just things to be mindful of. Everyone who participates needs to have access to the appropriate technology and materials. So if you're needing your interpreter to read something, they're going to need access to that. Your interpreter and your client are going to need access to computers, video, internet, all those pieces. That meeting should be set up by the professional who's requesting that interpreter. So whether you're doing that over Microsoft Teams like we are today, or whether that's Google Meets or Zoom, or however it's happening, that the professional that's requesting that service sets up that meeting and coordinates that setting, so that way it's all parties can be there and be there on time, and there's no like blurred lines as to who is hosting that conversation. Arranging space for in-person interpretation. So this is important. It's a little bit different for phone and video because you can't necessarily choose how, I mean, in some settings you can choose who's on your screen and how it looks, but you don't necessarily know what your client is seeing. But when you're in person, it's really great if you can sit in a way that allows more of a parallel conversation between the individual accessing the service and the professional. If it becomes more triangulated or circular, it really changes the dynamic in that room. It can give the interpreter almost like more power in the conversation rather than just being there to interpret. And so it's called parallel seating when the interpreter sits side by side with that individual accessing the service. I understand with COVID, we need to distance, and so things might be a little bit more triangulated, but trying to stay more where the interpreter keeps their eye contact more towards the professional, just like how the individual would keep their eye contact more towards the professional. This is also different with sign language because the signing professional interpreter would need to be able to face their individuals so that they can read the signs. You can't read them when they're beside each other. And so in that setting, the interpreter may choose to sit beside the professional, but still trying to keep that paralleled communication so that it's almost as though that interpreter is not there. Yeah, it can just really change the dynamics and change who that individual is asking their questions to, or what piece is there, and who they trust within that relationship. So we've talked about what we're going to do when we use interpreters and when to use them. How do we access them? What does that look like? So things you need to know when you're booking an interpreter. You need to plan ahead. Some languages can be harder to coordinate or find interpreters for. So planning allows more time to make sure that there's somebody available for that time. It can also sometimes be helpful to be like getting your interpreter connection first and then agreeing on a time with all three parties. And so both are good plans, but just that way you're not stuck trying to do this. We have no one, it's the day before. So anytime that you can plan ahead to make sure you have an interpreter, the better. And that will depend to availability will depend on what organization you're accessing, what languages they have available, how many people they have for that language. Also maybe how many people they have trained for that type of case. I know from my own organization, we have the 200 interpreters, but not all of them are trained to do assessments. So depending on what type of setting or case you're doing, what meeting you're having may limit who we're going to have present for that session. And so that can make things a little bit more tricky. Consider the time needed for that session. So with an interpreter, it might take longer. So you might want to plan for extra time to make sure that that interpreter doesn't get booked for something afterwards or have another appointment after and have to leave, or that you don't have something booked after and you have to leave, or you're canceling on somebody. So just really being considerate of the time that you're going to have there. Being aware of that client's language needs. What language do they speak? Is there a specific dialect? Is there a specific region? Are there any other details that you can give when trying to request an interpreter? Sometimes it can be helpful. Maybe you don't know the dialect or the region, but you can say they're from this country. That can help us assign the best possible professional for that case. Making sure that you communicate with the interpreter before that session. Our agency's practice specifically is that once they're assigned to your case, is that they call you. So you automatically get a connecting point with them. They call you to confirm and say, hey, I'm Chelsey. I'm the interpreter on your case on Wednesday. I just wanted to connect with you and make sure that you knew I was coming. Is there anything you need me to know beforehand? And then that's an opportunity to connect and make sure that there's anything. And you can always connect to that interpreter again before the session, or you can say, hey, can you come 10 minutes early so we can debrief, or I can connect with you, or can I have your email address so that I can send you a document so you have a bit of a heads up beforehand. It just helps really make sure that everybody's prepared for those conversations and to be able to do the best work that everybody can do in some of those settings. There are organizations across Alberta. There are probably more. I tried to get like a couple major cities here, but there are many more organizations. There are a lot of places that do translation, interpretation, transcriptions, all of those pieces across Alberta. The Family Center is the organization I work for. We have, like I said, 80 languages and dialects, 200 interpreters. There's choice for interpreters. They provide primarily for signing, is my understanding. And they're available in Edmonton and Calgary. They may also be available in other regions. I'm not 100% sure. Calgary has the Calgary Catholic Immigration Society and JR Language Interpretation Services. Red Deer has CARE. Lethbridge has Lethbridge Family Services. And so there are options across the province. There's also options that are in smaller communities as well. What I encourage you to do, and the reason why I have the 211 logo up there, is you can always connect with 211 if you want to know more about a service in your area or in your region. There are so many. Anytime I look for an interpreter, if I can't fill a need in another city, and I try to look for another option, there are so many options. And so don't lose hope. Make sure that it's okay to feel a little bit unsure or not know who to go to, but any organization that is providing professional interpreters will be able to help guide you in the right direction or connect with you to be able to get you an interpreter. And 211 is a great resource as well. Specifically, we offer services across all of Alberta and even beyond Alberta. So if you had, for some reason, I don't think you would have clients outside of Alberta, but maybe you have colleagues or people that you know, we can offer our interpretation services beyond Alberta as well. But anywhere in Alberta where you are, we can offer that service. We do offer in-person video and phone. And we also do translations and transcriptions. So if you needed an assessment translated, we can do that. If you needed a consent form translated, we can do that. There's lots of options, or like a newsletter, anything that you have that is something we can help with. Our interpreters do travel. So if you wanted something in person and you're like, oh, but they're in Edmonton, we do travel. So that is an option too if you need, but there are services in your direct city as well that you can utilize. Supporting local is great. So if there is somebody local to you that can offer wonderful services, I would agree that you should use them. If you choose to move forward with the Family Center, you can access our interpreters. We just ask that you email us. We have cis@familycenter.org, and we can provide you with like a fee schedule, booking forms, a list of like languages. We also have some cheat sheets about utilizing an interpreter, which is kind of what we went over today, but there is some more information in there too. You can, once you book with us, there's a booking form, you fill it out, you send it to us. We take care of all the coordinating. We then try to find our interpreters, figure out who's available, when they're available. We handle all of that, so you don't have to stress about it. You don't have to worry about trying to figure it out. It's one thing off your plate. And then the month following the interpretation, we would just send you an invoice for that service. And so it's quite easy to access our services. Yeah. Sandy, I'm ahead of schedule. I don't know if I just spoke too fast. But we have time for questions. I can also try to go back through anything that things are unclear about.
Hi, Chelsey. We've kind of lost Sandy there for a bit to start.
Yeah, I see that.
Oh,
That's
there she is.
okay.
Okay, I'll let her back in.
Perfect.
Mute.
My apologies, I was very trigger happy there with some controls on my headset and I dropped myself right out of the call. So I will apologize for that. I'm just going to load up our question bank here. And Chelsey, thank you. Let me just start with thanks. And it's okay. I would venture to say that most of our members, they're not crushed when we run ahead of time. Lots of folks are happy to actually still have a chance to grab lunch. So that's okay.
I was worried I was going to go overtime. I was like looking at my content yesterday again, and I was like, "Oh, I might have too much."
No, I think we're good. So I do have a few questions in the window, and I just want to say, even, I've worked with interpreters in the past, and um, even I had some aha moments, things that I don't know why they've just never dawned on me. So I appreciate some of the information that you've shared today, because it's like, oh yeah, of course there's a standard and some form of a code of ethics for professional interpreters. Of course there is. I don't know why that never dawned on me in the past, but so I really like those aha moments. But let's get to some of these questions here. I'll just start with, yes, if people haven't seen the slide deck, and the recording will be available after the session. Give us a day or so to get that up, and it'll be available on the ACSLPA YouTube channel. So when you go into YouTube, you can just search for ACSLPA and you will find all of our recordings there. So question for you that's specific here, I think probably to the Family Center, but do you employ both deaf and hearing ASL interpreters?
I do. I have both of them on my roster to ensure that we're able to fill that need for our deaf and ASL interpreters. I don't have any other forms of sign language, but I have received a couple of requests for different types of sign language. But the only two that I do offer is the deaf and ASL interpreters.
Okay, that's great. Let's see here. Somebody also just offered a tip in the window just to let folks know that Calgary Immigrant Women's Association also offers interpretation services in Calgary. So
awesome, thank you.
Good. Yeah, that's great. Now, there are a couple of questions here that I expected we would get this question. So what is the cost on average for an interpreter? And I'm going to ask a second half of that. Who typically pays for the interpreter? Is that the professional that pays, or is it the client that pays?
So at our agency, we primarily receive requests from organizations. And in those cases, on our end, we invoice the organization directly. And then that organization would be responsible for paying for that case. But there isn't a national standard for that. And so we've now opened up our agency to individuals also being able to request their own service. So if they're needing somebody to go to the bank with them, somebody to go to a walk-in clinic, whatever type of service they may have, they can request it themselves. And at that point, they set it up with us and they pay themselves. So for our specific organization, if it's an organization-based request, the organization is who we invoice. But sometimes we know that some of those organizations then expect their clients to pay them for that service. So it can depend a little bit. And in regards to fees, it also depends, I think, on the organization. So speaking to like Alberta as a whole, I've really seen a mix of rates. I know that some companies will charge per minute for phone and video. Some companies have most for anything in person have minimums. So for our organization, our minimums for if it's in a medical like setting, like at a hospital or in a legal environment, like in the courts, we have a minimum of 2 hours for in person. And then for everywhere else, if it's in person, the minimum is 1.5 hours for the length of a session. And then everything after that, we bill in 15-minute increments, but we'll bill real time. So if you put in a request for 5 hours and it only takes 3 hours, you would only be charged for the 3 hours. But the rates really do depend on the type of service. So there's different rates for phone versus there are for in-person, and they can vary from organization to organization.
Okay, so yeah, I'm going to follow up with that and just try and get you to give us maybe a range. Like, are you looking for, like, is it like, would it be like $30 an hour? Is it closer to $100 an hour, or
if I were to guess based off of the, like, I would say for in-person, I would say the market sits around, trying to do math here, I'm going to say around about $50 to $70 an hour for non-ASL. And for ASL, it is more because there is more of a regulation on the payment guidelines for how we pay ASL interpreters. And so sometimes ASL interpreters will be paid more. Okay. For phone, I would say most people are noticing that an hour would be closer to the kind of the same range, like $50 to $60 or $70 an hour.
Okay. So, and am I correct then in also assuming that if there's travel required for the interpreter, that travel would be an added cost?
Yeah, so at the Family Center, we do have anything that's outside of Edmonton city limits. There is travel expenses, but anything that is within Edmonton city limits is completely free. That's our agency specific again. So things may vary depending on who you're accessing your service through. And so I don't know for sure other local agencies or other agencies across the province what they're doing for travel.
Okay. And here's another, yeah, I have many of my own questions, but here's another question in the window. Can interpreters be hired on a longer term basis? So let's say you have a relationship with a client and it's for, you know, maybe X number of sessions for whatever type of treatment that we happen to be providing. So could you hire the same interpreter for X number of sessions, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. So our agency does a lot of this. We have on our booking form, we have a line that says, do you have any preferences around gender? So if you have a gender preference, maybe given your client for whichever reason, that may be a factor or the situation you're in. There's also then a line to write in if you're requesting a specific interpreter. So you can request, you're like, I've used this person before, I really liked them, I want to use them again. Or you have 6 sessions that you need to do. You can actually put in like one booking form with 6 dates and you have them all pre-booked and you ask the same interpreter and we can have all 6 with the same person. Sometimes people also find it helpful to do their first request, see how that first session goes. If they like them and they're a good fit, at the end of that session, coordinating the next one together and then sending us the booking form with that detail, with that next appointment date. So that way you can keep having that same interpreter. So there are a couple of ways to do that. We believe in continuity of care. We do it a lot. There are a lot of times that people are in therapy sessions or in a treatment program or receiving some type of ongoing service, and we will continue to do our best to have the same interpreter there every time, if it's requested.
Great. So you raise an interesting point. What should a person do if they've had an interpreter come, whether they've booked that interpreter or the family has brought that interpreter, and what if that interpreter isn't a great fit?
Yeah, I think that can happen, just like how sometimes a certain professional isn't a great fit or a personality isn't a great fit. At our agency specifically, we have feedback opportunities after every session. So you can give your feedback directly back to us, and that comes to us as an organization, and then we make sure that we do what we need to with that feedback, whether that's giving it to our interpreter or changing something within our program or adjusting a system. And so when we get that feedback, we're able to support that interpreter in making changes in their practice if there's something that needs to change, or adjust what types of services they are currently able to offer until they receive maybe more training, or we're able to just make sure that the next session we assign a different interpreter, and so that there isn't that component anymore. So yeah, we try to make sure that any feedback we get, that we take it seriously, we assess it, we review it, and take that back in whatever arena it needs to go back to.
Great. And I take it would be considered acceptable to, I don't know, give in the moment or real-time feedback to an interpreter if there's, if maybe it's recognized in that session that they might be queuing or providing extra information or helping the client.
Yes, absolutely. I think that that's great. Don't wait on stuff like that. It's going to impact your practice. And I think it's great if, as long as you're feeling comfortable as the professional, and I would encourage you to feel comfortable in that situation, to say, hey, I just noticed you queued them. It's really important that we don't do that in this setting. Or even if you notice, you're like, I think they're having like a separate conversation. You can be like, hey, just what are you talking about? Can I make sure that I'm looped in? It's okay to say those things and make sure that you're part of the conversation. They're supposed to be there as though they're not there. Their goal is to be present strictly to just bridge the communication gap.
Right. And I think that there's probably a lot less risk of that extra conversation when you're working with a professional interpreter versus a family member.
Yes.
So, yeah, so I do have, is it pretty common for families to bring their own interpreter? Like to bring a family member or?
I think as a general speaking in the community, I would say yes. I would say it is pretty common that people will bring their own interpreters to the doctor, to an appointment. Like I think families have learned how to get by without having to pay for their own interpreters all the time. And so they know who in their family can help them, and they have their natural village that is there as a support in their community, and they have a network and they utilize them. And I think that they do utilize them a lot. I think when it makes a difference, and what our agency sees a lot of requests for, is in situations where things get a little bit more complex, or they want to make sure that things are done a little bit more properly. And that's when we receive most of our requests. So when people are doing psych assessments, we get a lot more of those requests versus that being a family member. When there's a trickier diagnosis that's about to happen, we often will get those as interpreter requests. And maybe that a family member has been interpreting for the case the whole time, but at this point, there's a trickier, more complex situation about to happen, and they really want to make sure that everybody's feeling okay, everybody gets the messaging, everything is accurately done. And so the professional at that time will choose to hire a professional interpreter. So it's not that you need to stay professional the whole time, or that you need to stay informal the whole time. You can pick and choose. You can have certain ones where you have, for this test, I really want a professional, but for the follow-up and the everything else, I'm okay to use an informal. And so there are benefits to that as well, and for the client and for you. And so I think either is fine, but we do see that people, I think, use their own interpreters often. And if our interpreters show up to cases, this happens sometimes, they'll show up and the client will say, oh, but so-and-so is here. They're here to help me interpret. I don't need an interpreter. We ask our interpreters to connect with the professional and ask the professional what they want. So the person who's requested that service, do you want us to stay? Do you want and then that way that can be a conversation, because then maybe at that point they go, oh, I didn't know that they had somebody who could interpret. Or they say, no, I really want an interpreter. It's really important that I have a professional interpreter versus a family member or community member.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. So I'm just jumping backward a little bit here to the cost question. What's kind of the cost for a translation? So let's say somebody actually wants to translate. We'll use a consent form as an example. What would a consent form cost to translate?
Yeah, translation costs are tricky. So how our agency does it right now is we ask you to send us the document, and then we put together it's a free complimentary, no obligation quote that includes the cost of the service and the estimated completion time. And then you can decide what you want to do with that. We do our best to be competitive in pricing. Everything that we do for translations, we make sure we have a translator and a proofreader. So it's at minimum a 2-person team, sometimes more, to make sure that if it is, I'll back up for a second. For organization requests that come for an organization for a form that will be reused or be public, we make sure that we have a team of people working on it with a minimum of 2 people, where we have somebody leading up the project and another person proofreading that project collaboratively together. We make sure that all the formatting stays really well and everything looks really good and solid. The reason why I don't have a set rate for translations is because it really depends on the complexity of the document in regards to its formatting, its language use, the complexity of the document, and also which language it's going into. For example, Arabic reads right to left. So we're flipping your whole document around, including all of those texts and all those pieces. So it costs a little bit more for us to do that project versus translating something into French will often cost less because it stays in the same format, the same textual style. It uses our Roman alphabet. And so it does seem to change depending on the language and the type of document, how long the document is. We also are mindful of blank space. So some online services will just take your page count or your word count, where we try to be mindful of what is actually present on the page to quote you on truly the work we're actually doing.
Okay. And I have a final question. I see our question window is a little bit quiet right now, so I'll just, continue to DJ through it. But you talked about families or individuals being able to contact at least your organization. And I'm going to make an assumption that other formal organizations would have very similar service requirements that the Family Center has. But would we have lots of members who work in private practice, and so they might have sole proprietorships. Can they just call up a provider and just say, I'm trying to book an interpreter, or would they be required to have some kind of a contractual agreement, or how does that work?
Most organizations don't require a contract agreement to be able to provide interpretation services, but will offer one. So we have contracts with some organizations because they choose to have contracts, or because they put forward formal proposals that you apply for and get accepted to be like the sole provider of their interpretation services. But most organizations don't require a contract. But if you would like one, we'll write one, or sometimes they'll join one with you because it makes sense. But it's not a requirement, no.
Okay, that's great. That's very helpful. So I think that brings me to the end of my questions that I have. So I'll just give maybe another 10 seconds or so here for any additional questions to roll in through the window. And if we don't see any, then I will bring us to a close. So we'll just give us a minute here. Okay, I'm not seeing anything new arise. So let me just, on behalf of ACSLPA, say thank you to you, Chelsey, for coming and sharing your knowledge and information about working with interpreters with us. I think that this is an area that is sometimes overlooked. And when I start thinking about informed consent and my philosophy around informing and consenting being two separate processes, that that piece around having interpreters involved, you can really see value and merit in that. So thank you very much for your time today. And I'm sure that we'll be in touch again in the future about other topics.
Sounds great.
Great, thanks. Bye, everyone. Have a great afternoon.